Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to week 9, which we're calling Why Did They Go to Holland? And of course, they are our separatists who are soon going to be called pilgrims. Um, this week, we were working on a new scripture verse, and so you guys had just started to memorize part of Matthew 5:16. And the part that you should already know, I'll start you. Let your light shine before others. That's the first part that we worked on memorizing. And you guys did so well. In fact, you're doing so well on your catechism also. I'm so proud of you. And really, I just amazed at how your mind is absorbing all of those words. And I pray that your heart is absorbing what those words mean also as you say your catechism answers. And the same thing, of course, with our scripture verses. We want God's word, which is so powerful, to go into our hearts because it changes us on the inside. And that is what this verse is all about. Let your light shine before others. Well, where does that light come from? And you're probably saying Jesus, which is true, yes, but it comes from the inside of us. The light shines out. So let your light shine before others. The rest of that verse says, so that they may see your good works. So those are then the good things that you do, not because you thought it up and you really wanted to do something good, but because Jesus is changing your heart. He's changing you on the inside to make you desire those things, so that love and kindness and patience and long suffering and bravery and all those things just come out of you like a light because you've been changed on the inside by Jesus. Okay, and that changes what we call our character. Our internal character is changed by the power of the Holy Spirit. So we let God's word work in our hearts, and the power of the Holy Spirit change us so that our light shines before men, so that they may see your good works. And then what happens? They give glory to your Father who is in heaven. That's Matthew 5:16. So again, at the end of all of that, our light is shining and good works. We're doing those good things. And what is the end of all that? Not that we get praise, although sometimes we do. And if that happens, we should always be directing people back to Jesus so that they will give glory to our Father who is in heaven. Because guys, why did God create you and all things? For his own glory. So we are an instrument in his hand, just like I can pick up this instrument, a pen, and I'm writing the story, right, with a pen. Well, that's what God is doing. We're the pen. We're the instrument in his hand. And we want to see change. We want to see good works that are written with that pen so that people go, wow, that's amazing. And you say, all glory to God. Now, the fancy Latin phrase for that is soli Deo Gloria. To God alone be the glory. Soli Deo Gloria. Now, you guys have learned one other fancy Latin phrase, haven't you? That came out at the time of the Reformation when they were purifying the church, and that was sola scriptura. Do you remember what that means? The Bible alone. That means the ultimate authority, the ultimate answer. Doesn't mean that mommy and daddy don't have authority or that church leaders don't have authority, but it means that all of those different people that are in charge, all of them have to answer to one thing that's above them, and that is the Word of God. That God's Word, the Bible, prescribes, it tells everything about how we're to live, how kings are to live, how church officials are to operate, even how parents are supposed to govern in their own homes. All right, I think Mrs. Crusoe digressed. I got off my topic a little bit here. But the pilgrims, our separatists who are becoming pilgrims, they are just a perfect example of this verse. Let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. We see that over and over again in the lives of our separatists. So you guys, last week you started reading this book, Stories of the Pilgrims. And I want you to remember that these are real people. So the names that you encounter in this book, they are real children. Jonathan Brewster, Patience, Fear. You met, let's think, Mary Chilton. So you'll meet all kinds of characters, and these are real people that lived a long time ago, about 400 years ago, but they are a big part of the story of America. And of course, we're coming up to a big holiday, Thanksgiving. And that holiday that we celebrate goes back to, it relates directly to the stories of the Pilgrims. So last week, as I said, you started reading that book. And I want you to know that some of the places that you're reading about, of course, they still exist. Even some of the buildings are still there. Let me make myself small here so we can go. Well, of course, we remember that this story takes place when we got two new monarchs. That's a fancy word, isn't it? But that's just a king and a queen. Monarchs are kings or queens. And we got two new monarchs. We got a king and a queen, a new one when Queen Elizabeth died and had no children. And you guys know who these people are, right? Who are they? Just call it out. We have King James and his wife is Queen Anne. And you'll remember that Queen Anne was coming down that Great North Road from Scotland. That's where they lived. But now they're going to live in London. That is where the palace for the King and Queen of England is located. So they'll come down to London. And on her way to London, she stops at Scrooby Inn. Now, I have to tell you, this is not Scrooby Inn. Most of Scrooby Inn is gone today. There's only a little bit of it that's left. But right nearby, in a town right close by, also on the Great North Road, is this old hall. And it looks just like what Scrooby Manor would have looked like. So you can visit it today. It's the same age. It operated the same way. And so that's how we know a lot about what Scrooby Manor really looked like, or Scrooby Inn. Those names mean the same thing. Scrooby Manor was what it was called originally. And then, of course, people started to stay there like a hotel. So we called it Scrooby Inn. And then we looked at a map of where they were. Here's the Great North Road, right? Where Scrooby was in England. And this is where London is, where the king and the queen would take their crowns, the new king and queen, and where they would live. Now, there was another part of the story. Let me see what I wanted to review. Last week in class, when we were together for co-op, we mostly just reviewed the story, didn't we? We just kind of talked back through some of what we had learned as we read the book. And that's really what I want you to continue to do. But I'll review just a little bit of it with you right now. Well, the first thing we did in class is we practiced our bow and our curtsy one more time, which is how the children and the adults would have greeted Queen Anne when she visited Scrooby Inn. So we talked about that, how to respect and honor someone with a bow or with our curtsy. We also reviewed kind of what happened while she was there, that there was a conversation that Queen Anne had with Patience one morning right in the rose garden. And they talked about the Bradford rose, but Patience kept talking about who William Bradford was and why he came to Scrooby Inn and what all the other people who came, what were they doing? Do y'all remember? They were going to church. And the queen said, well, there's a very nice church right here in town. Why don't you just go to that church? And they said, oh, but that is King James's church. And Father says that the things they teach there aren't right, that they don't please God. And so we have to please God. And that's why we have church here. And then all of a sudden she realized that that was supposed to be a secret. And you guys, why was it supposed to be a secret? It was supposed to be a secret because it was against the law. You were breaking the law if you did not go every Sunday to church. They checked. And it was actually a law in England that you had to go and that you couldn't go anywhere else. So that's something that's kind of hard for us to even imagine today, living in America as we do, and with all the freedoms that we have. But that was the rule. And so she suddenly realized, Oh no, I've told a terrible secret. But Queen Anne said, don't worry, Patience, I will keep your secret. And I'm sure that she did. But probably some of the neighbors, some of the people in the town began to tell on the separatists. And soon, if you remember in our story, the king sent some men to the town. Do you remember that? And those men were kind of lurking around and they were spying and trying to figure out, where are these separatists going to church? And you guys, there was a message that they actually delivered to the separatist pastor. And you need to remember his name, John Robinson. John Robinson. And they delivered that message to him, and he opened up the message, and that message said that if they refused, the king knew, and if they refused to go to the king's church, that they would face punishment. So did they decide, okay, well then that's it, we're just going to start going to the king's church? They did not. Now y'all, that's character. That's something inside you that says, I can't do the wrong thing, even though I might face a consequence for it. I might have to go to prison. I might lose the things that I own, like my property, the wonderful things that I have, my dishes, my clothes, my home. Or worse, I might even lose my life. But it is so important to obey God rather than man. So goodness, that had to come from inside the Pilgrims, right? And the decision that they made, that became that light that shone before men. Other people saw their example, that they were willing to give up anything in order to obey God. So I hope you remember what finally happened to our separatists was that they were caught. They kept moving, remember, from house to house to house, almost like if our little families were the separatists. And so we had church one week at the Theus house, and church one week at the Gyrus house, and church one week at the Burford house, right? If we kept moving around so that they couldn't catch us, but finally the king's soldiers did catch up with them, right? You remember that they through all those families, even the little babies with their moms, everybody went to prison. And then some of their homes were even burned. Finally, it said in our book, and it's true, that the families were released, but the last person to be released was, I'm getting ahead of myself. Sorry, that's a different time. They released them. Now that they've suffered prison, did they decide, okay, that's too much. That is too much. We are just going to have to go to King James Church. No, that's not what they said. They knew in their hearts that that would be disobedience to God. And so they decided instead that they could no longer stay in England, even though King James said, I'm not going to let you leave. So he didn't want them to leave. He doesn't want them to worship the way that they feel that their consciences tell them that they must, that the Bible is telling them. So now they have a problem. What will they have to do? Escape, sneak out of the country. Well, the leader, William Brewster, he was the man who had Scrooby Inn. Make myself big while I'm talking to you. William Brewster, who had Scrooby Inn, he was their leader. He kind of organized them. And so he is the one who organized the first ship that was to take all of their congregation across the English Channel, which you can see in the map right here, across the English Channel. See where this little bump is right here? That's basically where they were leaving from to go over to Amsterdam. So he organized an English ship to take them. But do you guys remember what happened with that English captain? I hope you're remembering that he betrayed them. To betray means that he cheated on them. They organized, they paid money for him to take them safely across, and instead he took their money, he took all of their cargo that they brought on board, and he told the British soldiers, King James soldiers, where they were so that they would go to jail. So he sold them out, he betrayed them. They rifled through the women's clothing, they took all kinds of things that they owned, and the soldiers captured all of those families. So this is the time when they let the women and children go pretty quickly because they didn't know what to do with them. But the men they kept, and the one they kept the longest for several months, was William Brewster, because William Brewster had organized this whole expedition. And the other problem they had, of course, you guys, was when they came out of prison, where could they go? They didn't have homes anymore. They had sold their homes. They had packed up everything they had to bring in little chests to take across on the ship. So now they had to go and live with friends and try to organize things again. And so now did they decide, okay, this is just too much. It's too hard for our families. We must just give in and go to King James Church. No. Even though they had suffered again, they decided we're going to risk everything and we're going to try one more time to go to Holland. So this time they organized a different ship. This captain was from Holland. So over here, he was a Dutch ship captain. So Dutch means you're from Holland. I know it's a little, you should say you're a Hollander. But he was a Dutch captain. So he had to come across to pick them up. And you guys, this time, what happened was that the men all walked over the land from wherever they were staying to meet the ship. The women, they thought it was going to be too hard for the women and children, so they put them on a big flat boat called a barge and sent them down this river. And the river emptied into the ocean, so they knew they'll get there, and they sent them ahead so they'd have plenty of time. And the women actually got there to where the river met the ocean. They got there first. But the boat wasn't ready. So they kind of steered themselves over into a little place that was shallow to wait. And then the boat came. Oh, there's the boat. Out there, and the men are all loading up. But when it was time for the women to go, the tide was out. And so their barge was stuck in the mud and they couldn't go. Well, just at that moment, the king's soldiers all arrived. And so the men who were looking back at their families, can you imagine your dads being on that ship and looking back at you and your mom and all the things that everything's loaded onto the barge, and the ship's captain, the Dutch ship's captain, they said, please let us go. Let us go try to get our wives and our children. No, I can't risk it, he said. Oh, well, just let us off. Just let us go so we can go be with them. And no, I don't have time. Why? I know you remember. He said that his ship was all he had in the world. That was all of his property. And he was so afraid that the king's soldiers would capture him and his ship. And if they took it, that was all of his wealth, all of his money, everything he owned was tied up in that boat. He said, no, I can't. And so he pulled up the anchor and started to sail across the English Channel. So sailing from here all the way across towards Amsterdam with just the men, leaving the women and the children behind. Can you imagine the crying, the tears, the worry that all of this must have caused? Well, you know that trip does not turn out to be an easy one at all for the men and for that Dutch ship's captain. In fact, the ship's captain thought that maybe the horrible stormy weather that he was encountering was God's judgment on him for leaving the women and the children behind. You guys, the storms were terrible. They went on for days and days. One storm, terrifically awful, and then another one began. And at first they thought, well, this one won't be as bad. It's just a gentle rain. And then it just stirred itself up until it was worse than the first. And it got so terrible that ships were sinking all throughout the English Channel. In fact, almost none of them made it across to Amsterdam if they were at sea during that time. Now, William Bradford, you remember, William Bradford is younger. He was just a teenage boy when he came to live at William Brewster's home, Scrooby Inn. William Bradford, he was on the boat. He was part of that journey. William Brewster was not. William Brewster and John Robinson, the pastor, they had stayed behind with the families. They were trying to help them. They were kind of leading the women and children and helping them get aboard the ship. So they got captured again. But William Bradford was on the boat, and I want you to hear what he wrote about how terrible the storm was in that second storm. He said, the sailors had given up hope. That means the sailors thought that the ship was sinking. The sailors had given up hope. But then Bradford wrote this. But when man's hope and help failed, then the Lord's power and mercy came to save them. Wow, you guys, something amazing must have happened. Listen, he wrote that while the ship was tipping over, it was all the way on its side, they thought about to go under the waves. The sailors cried out. They screamed, "We're sinking, we're sinking." Just at that moment, the separatist men stayed calm. Even in that horrible moment, he said that the sailors were crying out, "We sink, we sink." And even when water ran into the mouths and ears of the separatist men, that they remained calm and they just cried out, "Lord, you can still save us. Lord, you can still save us." So can you picture that? The sailors crying out, "We sink, we sink." And the separatist men, "Lord, you can still save us. Lord, you can still save us." And guys, in that moment, the storm calmed, the ship popped upright, and everything went very quickly right back to normal. They must have looked around at each other like, what just happened? Guys, were they lucky? Of course not. There's no such thing as luck, no such thing as coincidence. That was God's providence. And do you know when that Dutch captain pulled into the port in Amsterdam that people rushed down to the docks and they couldn't believe it because almost no ships had survived that storm. They hadn't had any ships coming in to the docks because they had all been sunk. But which one had survived? This one with our separatist men. Wow, guys, do you think Matthew 5:16 is true? Let your light shine before men so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. I think that's exactly what happened. Those separatist men let their light shine before others, right? They stayed faithful. They stayed trusting God even in the worst moment. And God worked. Who got the glory in that moment? God did. It was very clear, right? It wasn't, oh, thank goodness. Now, were they grateful that they had those separatist men who were praying fervently to God? Absolutely. But everybody was clear. It wasn't the separatist men who saved the day. God answered their prayer and God got the glory. So they would let their light shine before others. Those others on the ship, those sailors, saw their good works and gave glory to their Father in heaven. How awesome. But you guys, we didn't finish the story. What happened to all the women and the children and William Brewster and John Robinson, the ones that got left behind, thrown in jail again, right? And this time they let everybody out except for, again, William Brewster and John Robinson. The men were always held longer. The women and children, they didn't quite know how to keep up with them and what to do with them. So once again, they found themselves in the houses of their friends and trying to regroup and figure out how were they going to meet up with their husbands? Were their husbands coming back? What would they do? Well, as you know, eventually King James decided enough's enough. He threw his hands up and said, fine, let them go. Almost like Pharaoh, right? That God had hardened Pharaoh's heart over and over again until finally Pharaoh said, fine, let them go. Well, that's what happened. King James finally said, just let them go. And so those women and children and John Robinson and William Brewster now were able to leave and go across the English Channel. That's what this water is called here, the English Channel, over to Amsterdam, where they were reunited with their families. Now, the exercise you need to do at home is glue two of those tiny little ships. I gave you two little tiny ships to take home. And so the first one is the English ship. That's the English captain who was so wicked and who sold his pilgrim clients into captivity. And so his ship, we're going to put like, maybe you could put it like right here, okay? And you can even put it attached to the land a little bit, like half in the land, half in the water, because they never left. He loaded them up and they were captured immediately. So put it on the left-hand side of your, I know it opens up. Where's my little map? Here we go. This big. There we go. So we want to put our English captain maybe right here, right there, okay, the English ship. And then, of course, the Dutch ship, which made it across. I want you to be sure you put that right next to Amsterdam on the right-hand side. So glue that in there. All right, so pause and glue your ships in if you haven't done that already. I also want you to know that all that suffering, we've talked about how many times they went to prison. We haven't talked about how many times were they fined money. They had to pay money, or their homes were burned, or they had physical consequences like their ears clipped. Terrible things that happened to our separatists. But William Bradford wrote down in his book, remember we talked about his book of Plymouth Plantation, and he wrote down what happened because of that terrible suffering that the separatists endured. He said lots of English people could not believe that these families were so brave and loved Jesus so much and wanted to do things just like the Bible said, so much that they were ready to suffer just to be able to worship God the way the Bible said. And soon, he wrote, lots more people in England began to want to please God more too. They began to want that even more than being afraid of the punishments of King James, because they had watched how patient and trusting the separatists were and how the separatists never gave up. You guys, the women, the children, the people that were left behind, really all of the separatists, because it happened over and over and over again to those families, they let their light shine before others, and those others saw their good works and gave glory to their Father who is in heaven. So again, this example of Matthew 5:16 that you see in the life of our separatists. So now, you guys, in our class, we got them over to Holland. And we started to talk about some of the things that they saw there and they met that were so different than their life in England. So we looked at some pictures like dikes. So this would be the English Channel. This is seawater. And over time, the people in Holland had built these things called dikes. So they piled up earth where this side used to be swampy and wet, but they would pile up the dirt and they would pump the water out, pump it up and over, and they would make walls, kind of like you do when you build a sandcastle at the beach. And you have to keep that water out, right? And build your walls high, and here comes the ocean, Now, thankfully, they didn't have usually terrible waves crashing all the time, but they had to build those dikes high and strong. So they were walls and covered in earth, and then you can see their little street ran up here. So in our book, it talks about when our separatists first arrived and were headed to their new homes, that they were walking along the little road and they could see the tops of the houses. They were looking right at the chimneys. So see here how you're walking along, and instead of seeing the front door, you're up high. So you're looking at the roof, and they could see the chimneys. We also talked about when they moved into their houses in the city, that it was very different than what they were used to in the country. So houses were lined up all close together, and instead of streets, you had canals. And people moved around the city, not so much on horse and carts, some horses and carts, but mostly the main roads were canals, which are like rivers, little tiny rivers. And so boats are how everybody got around from place to place, and that's how fresh produce came to town and everything that needed to be delivered, just like you have the Amazon truck, but everything that they needed had to come in on a boat. So you remember, like water that had to come in. They brought all their water in, and that was because, remember how much seawater they had, salt water? So you couldn't just go dig a well in the backyard. You wouldn't get good water there because there was too much salt. So they had to bring water in from further out in the country where the water was fresh and good. So everybody had to refill their water, and you had to wait for them to bring it in every week. This is another picture of the canals in Amsterdam, where our separatists first lived. This also gives you an idea here of like the river boats that they talk about, or I've forgotten their names, our characters. right here. I don't. Jan and Katrina, I think it was Jan and Katrina, that lived on a boat. This is kind of the size of the boat that they would have lived on and traveled through the canals. This is just one more picture just to help you get into your mind the idea like Jonathan Brewster and his sisters Fear and Patience and little baby Love, right, coming out of their home, and they would come out onto the steps and they could sit here. This is where they would visit with the Dutch children when they came in on the boats. This is kind of what the inside of one of the Dutch homes would look like. So remember, new food, hodgepodge and Gouda cheese that we tried, and stroopwafel, yum. So everything was new and different to them here, including what their homes looked like. So their homes were smaller. When you went in the front door, there was not like a big living area usually. It was kind of a multi-purpose room. So the kitchen was right there. You walked right in now to the kitchen area, a place where they cooked. Sometimes they did have a little seating area, and sometimes you'd have right there a bed. Box beds, they were called. They were built into the wall. You could pull the curtains during the day so nobody could see. But these box beds were very popular. Oh, you guys, look at this little thing. See it hanging on the wall? That looks like a pan with a very long handle. That's a bed warmer. It gets cold in Holland and damp. So if you want to warm up your bed before you get in it, you put some coals from the fire, some of the wood that's burned down, just little chunks of kind of, you've seen it in your campfires, just kind of a little red glowy. So you put that in there, and then you rub it around in your bed between your sheets, and it gets everything nice and warm. Then you dump the old ashes back in the fire and jump in that bed and pull those curtains, or sometimes it was little cabinet doors that you had to close. But once you're inside, nice and toasty warm. So that's why they had box beds. Now, something else that I hope you're seeing in these pictures are these blue and white dishes. So people in the Netherlands loved blue and white, and they made lots of china that was blue and white, just like that. In fact, it's called, the place that they made the most of it was Delft Haven. You do not have to remember that. But even today, we bring ships in to America. People love blue and white dishes, blue and white jars and decorations and tiles, but today they're made in lots of places. But if you want the original, they come from Delft Haven, and it's called Delftware. Delftware is that fancy blue and white. They made tiles for their kitchens out of it. Oh, here it is right here. See how their kitchen is tiled in Delft? They're hanging their plates there on the wall. They always had tile floors. And you guys, this is all because it is wet where they are. Remember how they're taking the land back from the sea and they're pumping all the water out? But that means naturally it's just always a little damp and mucky. It's hard to get things super, super dried out unless you're up on higher ground. So they had to adapt their life for kind of moist places. So tile, you don't want a dirt floor because it would be muddy a lot of the time. That's why they have tile floors. Also, tile floors are easier to clean, aren't they? If you come walking in and you have muddy shoes. Now, you guys even looked at the kind of shoes that they wore, and we learned the word for that. Do you remember the word? Klompen, right? It makes sense. We're klomping in our shoes, our wooden shoes. But that's why they had wooden shoes, was to keep the moisture out, kept their feet nice and dry and warm. And if you remember, you were kind of up a little bit. They weren't real flat like tennis shoes to the ground. They were kind of, you sat up a little bit, and that was to keep you up out of the muddy, moist ground. But where did those shoes go when you got to the house? Outside. So you would take your muddy wooden shoes off outside, clean them up later, but you don't want that traipsing into the house. I think that's all my pictures here. Oh, one more of what their homes might have looked like. So very different than the homes in England. We just had a little garden out in the back, so you grow your vegetables and flowers and things there. But it was not farm land. That's what they were used to. They had come from farming towns, and they had great big pastures and woolly sheep running everywhere. and growing food, and that's not how they lived when they got to Amsterdam. So that was hard too. What if your whole life had to change because you were in this new town? You were forced to go there simply so you could worship Jesus the way that the Bible said. Oh, here was something else new. When they walked by and saw those chimneys, they saw a new kind of bird. They'd not seen these birds before. What are these? Storks, right? Storks. And I think it was Jan. Let me check. Okay, no, it was not Jan. It was Carl. Y'all remember Carl Vetter and his little brother Hans. So Carl and Hans owned the water barge. But Carl came by. Okay, nope, pause. Rewind. Mrs. Crusoe got it wrong. Too many Carls in this book. This is a different Carl. This is Carl Van Zant. So, little Carl Van Zant was their neighbor there in those row houses. But if you remember, Carl was the little boy that had the 2 dogs that pulled the cart, and he sold milk and cheese and all that. And he got into discussion with Jonathan Brewster about storks, because Carl thinks that they are good luck. Does Jonathan Brewster believe that? He does not. Why do you think he doesn't believe that? Because you guys, he believes the way you do, that there's no such thing as luck, no such thing as coincidence, only God's providence. And that is what he told Carl. But that was one, again, the new things that they see are these storks on top of the chimneys making their nests. Something else they saw, tulips, windmills. And you guys, we talked about the purpose of a windmill, that the windmill is actually a mill in many cases. So as those big sails that you see as they turn inside the structure, it's turning these gears that make 2 stones rub together, and people pour in like corn kernels or wheat, that it grinds it until it's a fine powder. And that fine powder is cornmeal or wheat flour. And once you have that, you can make wonderful foods with it. So sometimes it really is a windmill, and the mill are the stones grinding together. But sometimes the windmill is used to turn a big screw, and that screw is pumping water out. So windmills stand all along the dikes. Let's see if I have a picture of that. So you see a little bit more here, several in a row. But there are windmills all along the dikes, and those windmills are not for grinding corn. Those windmills are for constantly pumping water back into the sea. So when it comes over or seeps through and it gets mucky and moist, we're pumping that water back out into the ocean. So they stand like soldiers guarding those dikes. And then, of course, tulips. Oh, here's a better picture of them all in a row, pumping the water back out. And I thought this was fun for you to see, because we also learned about what winter was like when they were there in Amsterdam, that the canals and the rivers freeze. And so you could go and skate. Do you remember there was a whole chapter about what winter was like in Holland, and that they now got around town. They don't need boats. Well, sometimes they did use boats, right? But a different kind. But you could skate from place to place and play games out on the ice. But they also talked a little bit about the ice boats. Guys, those still exist today in Holland. You can go and see in the wintertime that they're out there with ice boats. So they put these little skis on them, and the wind still catches the sails, but it moves them across the ice instead of moving them across the water. Isn't that cool? So different than anything they had ever seen before in England, or certainly anything that we see where we live. Now, in the chapters that you read last week, it also mentioned that finally our separatists decided that they needed to leave Amsterdam, that they were going to move to a new town called Leiden. Leiden is also in Holland, but it's a little further away. And the reason, guys, that they were moving to Leiden, I don't think the book tells you a lot about that, but it was because they needed different jobs. They were having a hard time making money for their families, and they were used to being farmers, and they couldn't be. So what were they going to do? Well, there was a big business that was growing really strongly in Holland right at this time in God's providence. And it was fabric production, making wool fabric. And the place that was most known for this was Leiden. Now, they were very familiar with wool because in England, many of them raised sheep for the wool that they grew. And that wool was turned into fabric. Now, they had not been makers of fabric before. Now they would have to learn that part of the skill. And so they moved to Leiden, and most of them took jobs in the factories there. They called them mills, the wool mills. So that's where they worked when they moved to Leiden. But along the way, of course, they saw windmills. It described that to you, and it said that they saw fields and fields and fields of tulips. So in class, of course, we did a craft to help you understand the windmill, and we did a craft where you guys created your own beautiful tulip, remembering this favorite flower of the people in Holland. In fact, there came a time when certain kinds of tulips became worth millions and millions of dollars. Isn't that crazy? I probably shouldn't have said dollars. They were worth millions and millions of Guldenmund, right? You remember your coins? Guldenmund. People would pay millions of Guldenmund for a single tulip if it was the right kind. It was called tulip mania. That happened not long after the Pilgrims lived there, but that's a story for another day. All right, now, before I finish up this video, I wanted to give you just a little bit of information that's going to help you with this week's reading. So you're going to pick up in Leiden, and we're going to be reading about what happens to our separatist families and how they become pilgrims. And soon we're going to see that they call themselves pilgrims. And you guys remembered what a pilgrim is. A pilgrim is somebody who follows Jesus no matter what, right? And recognizes that it means they have to kind of travel along a path following Jesus no matter what it takes. And they always know that their real home, their final home, is in heaven with Jesus. So they're willing to go wherever God leads them. That's a pilgrim. So they recognized and called themselves pilgrims coming up. That's this week. So they are going to go from Leiden to eventually realizing that they need to go somewhere else. That's what you're going to be reading about this weekend, about their big trip across the Atlantic Ocean to come to the New World, and what that was like, and what it was like when they arrived. So you'll hear some of those details, but there are some things that are left out in the book. And so I want you to hear them from Mrs. Crusoe so that you have a little bit more. You understand when you're reading maybe a little bit more of why they did what they did or what exactly happened on the trip over. So as far as why they left, William Bradford in his book, again, I'm going to read to you. This is his original words. I'm going to read to you in the little more simplified version, which is With God in the Wilderness. And it's his words, but simplified so we can understand it a little better. But here's what he wrote. He said, after reaching the Netherlands, we struggled for several years to make a new home in this strange land. But after we had lived here 11 or 12 years, our leaders began to fear the coming of greater dangers. Here's the greater danger that was coming. You guys, again, you can't make this up. They arrived just when a peace treaty was signed. In other words, there had been a war going on in Holland. But just when they needed to escape England, peace was made in Holland, and they were able to come to a peaceful country where they had the freedom to worship as they desired. But just before that, King Philip II and the Spanish army had been in Holland trying to force Holland back into the Catholic Church. So Philip and his troops were gone. Here they came, but they realized the peace treaty looks like it might be ending. And this was all happening at the exact moment when they were realizing that they were probably going to need to go somewhere else anyway. And he tells you why. So, but one of the reasons was it looks like the peace treaty might be ending. Well, isn't it amazing that the peace treaty lasted just exactly the years that our separatists were in Holland or needed a safe place to be? All right, so not lucky, not coincidence. That is providence. Here's what he says now. Many of our number were growing old and were unable to continue the life of hard labor necessary to survive in the Netherlands. Working in those mills was too much, but what were we going to do in order to earn money, right? The children also were suffering from the physical difficulties of the country. So the children too, all that hard work in the factories was not good for them. It was different than being outside and working on a farm. But then he says, still more lamentable. That means just really sad. He said, still saddest thing, and of all the sorrows, the most heavy to be borne, the saddest thing of all was that many of the children, influenced by the difficulty of the present life, looked on the great godlessness of the young people of the country and the temptations of the city, and were led by evil example into dangerous paths. That means they looked around at some of the other Dutch kids and they went, their life looks pretty fun, even though they were doing really bad things. The separatist children started to think, I might like that life. It says they cast off the reins of authority. That means they started to rebel against their parents. They abandoned their parents. It says, we saw that our posterity, that means our children, were in danger of becoming corrupt if we remained where we were. So of all the things that were terrible, that we needed to maybe make a move, he says the worst thing, the thing we cared about the most, were our children. You guys, these were parents and grandparents who cared more about their children than they cared about being comfortable. And so they were willing to face what they knew was a dangerous journey, and they had heard terrible things. I will not read to you all of this. You should read it. William Bradford writes about all the terrible things they had heard about the Indians in the New World and the terrible things that they might face. Dangerous journey. They knew it was going to be hard to start a colony. Plus, they knew that they had savage Indian tribes that they would face who might do terrible things to them. And yet they said, we would rather do that than let our children fall away from God and become unholy and sinful and pursue the terrible things that the Dutch children were doing. But then he says this, let me make myself small. Last and not least, okay, so if it's not least, that means it's not the least important thing, but it is last. He says they had a great hope and inward zeal. That means inside of them, they really wanted to do this. They wanted to lay a good foundation, or at least make some way for propagating and advancing the gospel of the kingdom of Christ. That means inside of them, they had this burning desire to go and start putting down foundations for growing the gospel of Jesus Christ, right? The true worship. Not the unpurified, but the purified worship of Jesus. They wanted to go plant that in the new world. He kept writing. He wanted to do it in those remote, that means far away parts of the world, even if we are but stepping stones for others for the performing of so great a work. So he said, even if we don't get to see the work, we're going to go start the work of spreading the gospel, telling people about Jesus in parts of the world where it's not known yet, right? So guys, are stepping stones, is that glamorous? Would you say, I want to grow up and be a stepping stone? I'm going to lay down in the mud and let people just walk on me. Stepping stone is not glamorous, but stepping stone is so important. People don't usually know the names of the stepping stones. They know the names of the people that walked on this, right? I hope I'm making sense. But people who act like stepping stones, who just boost other people, we don't usually know their names. They're not famous, but they're so important. And God writes his story with people who will be stepping stones, who don't care about their own glory, right? But who recognize they were made so that others will give glory to their Father who is in heaven. So these pilgrims, that's how they lived. And they said, we don't care about glory for us, but we're willing to lay down in the mud and do whatever it takes so that people will know about Jesus. That's our other reason for going. So guys, their big reasons, their two biggest reasons were for their children and so that they could spread the gospel to places that didn't know it yet. And of course they wanted to go a place, we know, to worship God the way that they believed that the Bible was telling them to. And they were afraid now with the Spanish army coming that would be threatened. So those were their reasons for saying, now is the time. It's time for us to go somewhere new. So they're going to get on board a boat called the Speedwell. This is a wonderful painting. This is a real painting. It's huge and it hangs in your United States Capitol Rotunda. And I'm going to teach you more about this painting later this week. So I will not teach you all about it right now, but there's so many, if you look closely and look at all the details in it, it's wonderful. But I do want you to picture them leaving Holland. Here's Holland over here on this side. And they've boarded the ship and they're headed off to New England, to a whole new world, a whole new experience. And how sober their faces are, right? They're happy to go, they're glad to go, but they know that this is going to be a difficult journey. And it was a difficult journey. So this is what William Bradford wrote about that. This is the first time that we see them use the word pilgrim. So I want to make sure you had, again, that's not in your Pilgrim Stories book this week. So I want you to know that this is the first time they called themselves pilgrims. William Bradford said they left that city, which had been their resting place near 12 years, but they knew that they were pilgrims and looked not much on those things, but they lifted up their eyes to the heavens, their dearest country, and quieted their spirits. So they are peaceful, they're resting in the comfort of Jesus because they knew we are pilgrims and we're going to follow Jesus wherever he leads. I want you to know, again, this is a chart that shows you who the passengers were on the Mayflower. And this is important, too, because I just told you that the boat was called the Speedwell. And you're going to learn this week in your stories that the Speedwell is the boat that leaves Holland. And then they were supposed to meet one more ship in England, and then two boats were going to go across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World. So Speedwell was going to meet up with another boat called the Mayflower. And she did. They met up in a port called Plymouth, England, and they started to sail together. And then they found out the Speedwell had leaks, and the Speedwell couldn't go. The Speedwell had to turn around and go back. Now what to do? The Mayflower came back with them. They all turned around. Can you imagine? Oh, we just got going. And so they had to turn around and go back. And now the Speedwell couldn't go. And so some people stayed behind. And a few people, extra folks, loaded into the Mayflower, and the Mayflower was the only one that then went across the ocean and winds up in Cape Cod. It's where they wind up landing, in Cape Cod in North America. So this chart actually shows you who the Mayflower passengers were, who wound up being part of that 102 passengers that made the 66-day trip across the Atlantic Ocean. This was after they regrouped. And y'all, this is so wonderful, so powerful. I'm going to make sure you have one of these for your notebook so you can see who these families were. Like, here's the Brewster family, and it shows you Jonathan and Patience. I'm sorry, not Jonathan yet. Let me look real quick. Who came? Wrestling Brewster came with his parents. It looks like, oh yeah, Jonathan, Patience, and Fear did not come quite yet. They're going to come later. Or John Alden. This is a man that you hear mentioned. He actually started out as part of the ship's crew and then decided that he would stay with the Pilgrims. Or here are the Allertons. You remember Benjamin Allerton was mentioned, and here's Mary Allerton, little kid. I've got to check her name. I think it says remember. And Bartholomew Allerton. Or this is the Chilton family, and that's little Mary Chilton, not so little anymore. She's a teenage girl. So many of the families that you hear mentioned in the story, you'll see them represented in this chart. But I also want you to hear what William Bradford wrote about when they were in Plymouth and they had to decide who's going to go on the Mayflower, who's staying behind. And they had started out with, several hundred people, and now only 102 would go. But this is what he wrote. He wasn't discouraged by that. He said, and so, like Gideon's army, this small number was divided, as if the Lord thought these few too many for the great work he had to do. What does that mean? Guys, do you remember that when Gideon was fighting battles for the Lord, that God kept bringing the number down and down and down and down until he had just a few? God said, eliminate those guys if they're drinking water a certain way, and eliminate those guys. Why? So that Gideon would win the victory with a very few men, and everybody would say, how is that possible? Because Gideon's God fought for him, right? Everybody would know that God would get the glory. And that's what William Bradford saw. Isn't that wonderful? That instead of being discouraged by about half of their people having to stay behind in England, he said he sees it entirely differently. He says, you know what? God is going to get more glory because there's only a few of us that are going. Like Gideon's army, our small number was divided, as if the Lord thought that these few were still too many for the great work that he had to do. God's going to do a great work, and God will be glorified because it's just a few of us letting our light shine before others so that they see the good work and give glory to our Father in heaven. What a wonderful attitude in the midst of a hard thing. So the voyage across, again, you're going to read about it this week. And in your stories of the pilgrims, you guys, it's written for children, and you are children. So I don't want to take any of that away. But I need you to know it's a little more serious than what you see in this book, okay? It was a horrific, terrible, dangerous trip. 102 passengers, all squeezed into what's called the 'tween decks. And they were never allowed up on the top deck, or almost never. I mean, maybe if it was very calm, you could come up for just a moment to get some fresh air and sunshine. Almost never, though, were they allowed up on the decks. There was work going on up on the decks. The sailors were sailing the ship. It was too dangerous, and so they were kept in the 'tween decks for 66 days, much of it stormy, wave-tossed weather. On board were 49 men, 18 adult women, and 3 of those women were pregnant, and 35 people under 21. What does that tell you? Who were they coming for? Remember what they said? They called them posterity. That's their children. Guys, they were making this journey because of those young people. They wanted to bring those young people and get those seeds planted in really good soil. And so that's why you see so many young people and children and babies on board this ship. Now, one baby's going to be born on the way over, and I'm not going to give it away in the story. You'll hear about that. And another baby is born right after they arrive. And they're not as clear. They don't really give you that detail, but just so you know, one was born like literally on the trip over, and the other one was born once they were anchored. They hadn't come ashore yet in Provincetown Harbor. This is kind of the 'tween decks. It's not a great picture. It's a little fuzzy, but just to give you an idea that it's dark and the ceilings are low, and we're all very cramped in there with animals that we're bringing. And in fact, they had a whole shallop, a small boat, I should say, not a ship, a small boat that had been all broken apart in pieces. It would have to be assembled when they got there, but all the pieces for a shallop with masts and sails and all that was stored in there as well. So it was just so crampy for 66 days. And can you imagine somebody having a baby in the middle of all that? I'm sure they strung up some sheets or something, but, not a lot of privacy. And they were sick, and it was terrible. Boredom and sickness and seasickness and all kinds of other things that swept through our pilgrims. And this is a Mrs. Crusoe thought, but when you have to do that with 102 other people, you either wind up like just really mad at each other, or you just really start loving each other and taking care of each other. And I really believe that God allowed even more suffering for our pilgrims because he needed to bind their hearts together towards one another. And that's exactly what happened. They bind themselves together. They become so close and so tied to each other. And they're going to need that when they get to the New World. And then one last thing that's mentioned in the book on page 102, read you what they say. When they finally spot land, "This is not the sunny Southland we had hoped to find," said their governor, John Carver. "The storms have driven us too far north for that." "No, this is not the sunny Southland, but land of any sort is a joyful sight after our long voyage," replied Elder Brewster. "Let us not forget to thank God who has brought us safe to this new land." And that's all that's said about that. Well, you need to know one little extra thing. So this map is fancy and detailed and all that, but it shows you that there were two sections of the New World, and two different companies kind of ran these sections. So this red section was all the Virginia Company, and this green section was all called the Plymouth Council. That's who was in charge of it. Well, our guys, they got their charter, their permission slip to come. The king has to sign off on it, but you had to go through one of the companies, and they went through this one, the Virginia Company. Same company that had started Jamestown. Right here where this J is, that's Jamestown that you learned about. So they had to settle somewhere in the land that belonged to the Virginia Company in this red zone. So they were aiming for this star, which is basically where New York City is today. They wanted to be really far away from Jamestown, but they had to stay in the red zone. They wanted to be far away from Jamestown, you guys, because what church did they have there in Jamestown? Did they have King James Church? You betcha. And they, again, want the freedom to worship according to what the Bible says. So they wanted to be far away from Jamestown, but still be in the red zone. So they knew what they were aiming for. Somewhere right up here is what they were looking for. But as the book said, storms, they kept blowing them north, and their captain repeatedly kept trying to steer them to the south, and finally it got too far into the winter time. It was November, and he said, "We can't keep trying. We have got to get you settled in. You've got to start because it's going to get too cold. You won't be able to survive." And so finally, see this little hook of land right there? That is called Cape Cod. And they kept being blown right there to Cape Cod. And the captain finally said, "Fine, we have to come inside the little hook right in there. That is where we're going to settle." And you guys, that is not luck. That was not coincidence. That was providence. Because they landed up here in the green zone and not in the red zone, they didn't have a permission slip. What do we do if we don't have our charter, a permission slip? That means we don't even have any rules for how we're going to govern ourselves because they're not valid. We don't have a license or a ticket for up here. So we're going to have to write one for ourselves. And they did. They wrote their own rules, and all the men signed for all the families. And they agreed how they were going to govern themselves. And they knew how to do it because they had good English Bible law. And they had been governing themselves in their own church for 12 years. Remember, not part of King James Church. And they had to have government in their church, and they've been doing it just like the Bible said. And they said, "We're just going to do that in our town, in our little settlement or our colony." And so they wrote their own way to govern. And it's really famous. You're going to learn lots more about it later as you get big, but it's called the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact. And every man signed it before they ever left that boat and said, "We agree to be governed according to these rules, and we're going to pick who's going to govern it. We're going to pick our leader, and we all agree to obey what they say, but we're going to pick, and they're going to govern according to Bible law. So the law is going to be over the king, but we're going to do it. It's not the king who's setting our rules before us. We're going to make our own rules for how we govern ourselves according to the law of God." Isn't that amazing? This is the beginning of America, you guys, the Mayflower Compact. And it never would have been written never would have been signed if not for those winds that blew them far away from where they were supposed to land in the sunny Southland. Okay, that is all the preview that I need to give you before you start reading. And this week, you guys, your homework is really just to read and understand what you're reading. And so I gave you a vocabulary list and I gave you a characters list so you can check off the people that you meet. But wow, the adventure continues. So have fun reading and we'll have some wonderful activities to help you learn a little bit more when we meet for class next time. Bye, guys.